Okay, well, welcome everybody to this seminar. I'm very happy that you've joined us this afternoon for what I hope will be a very interesting and helpful conversation, because if, like me, you're not a tech person, but you are keen to understand the role that various types of technologies can play in enabling data trust, then this is the place to be. One thing I will flag at the start, before I start introducing the work of the Data Trust Initiative, etc., because that's really important, is in this conversation today, we have three panelist members who have more technical expertise than I have. And I will assume that quite a few people in the audience are like me. They are keen to understand as well as they can, but they sometimes don't know what technical terms mean. So if you hear something that you don't understand in the contributions from the panelists, for instance, please use the chat and, just, there is no silly question, just write down what you don't understand. It'll be very helpful because actually that allows the more techie people in the audience to potentially help with answers and clarify use of technical terms. I've already asked the panelist members to be as non-specialized as possible in their contributions, but I know sometimes it's hard to avoid the use of technical terms. So we will unfold this conversation in a way that's at least, I will try to make it as accessible as possible to everybody. So first I should say a few words about the Data Trust Initiative. Yeah, this is, obviously, I find it a very exciting initiative, but it's funded by the McGovern Foundation. And the aim is to go from theory to practice when it comes to data trust. Now, I'm thrilled to say that we're about to announce the two first data trust pilots that will be launched imminently. I think they will be made public in the next week. This is a very important moment for us. And it means that seminars like this one, which explore, practically speaking, concretely, what roles different types of technologies can play, are very important. So I want this conversation also to be very practice oriented. And again, I should emphasize that contributions from the audience are key and there is no silly question. So at the end, so we will have contributions from our panelists, whom I will introduce in a few minutes. And then there will be space, there will be 35 minutes or so for a general conversation from the audience. So the panelists today, well, I'm not going to go for long introductions because if I had to read their CV, we would still be there in half an hour. So I will just say this, that we have Irene Ng, who's joined us as the CEO of Dataswift, and she's also a professor at Warwick University. We have David Alexander, who is the founder and chief executive of Mydex. And last but not least, we have John Ainsworth, who's professor of health informatics at the University of Manchester. Now, I think David has asked me to be last as a panelist contributor. So I think I will give the honor to start to Irene, if she doesn't mind. So Irene, the floor is yours. The idea is that each panelist makes a pitch of between 5 and 10 minutes, being as accessible as possible, as I emphasized. And then we will allow for questions. Initially, I will ask each panelist to think of one question addressed to a fellow panelist. Okay, so listen to each other and think of a question you'd like to raise. And after that, we'll open up the conversation and questions to the audience. Okay, so Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. Can you hear me okay? And hello, everybody. It's 11:36 p.m. here in Singapore, which is where I'm calling from. And so it's a bit late, but it was actually a little bit funny because about less than 20 minutes ago, I'm still having wine and a dinner. So I'm starting to feel like all the headiness for a lot of wine and then getting into the seminar. What I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about our architecture and how we are enabling data trust and how we're thinking about data trust. Just want some confirmation from someone out there, maybe Sylvie, to tell me that you can actually see my screen. I know it's dark right now, but can everybody see this?
Sylvie? I can see you fine. Yeah, I can see your screen.
Okay,
Irene,
So let me explain a little bit about Dataswift and what we do and the architecture that we're looking at in terms of enabling data trust. So what we are is Dataswift. We operate the essential infrastructure to give and tools to give, take, and use data responsibly. We have 3 layers of our architecture. At the bottom layer is personal and organization data accounts. This is infrastructure for data storage and transactions. Above that is data passport, and above that are data pass networks, which I will help quickly explain. Let me start from the beginning. Right at the base, Dataswift provide legally owned storage of data in data accounts for every server owner. This is an actual legal ownership of which is intellectual property rights owned by every individual person or SME or company in the world. It is equivalent to a banking infrastructure in terms of service, server and storage. We had the benefit of building this from learnings of more than £5 to £6 million of UKRI research through the HAT microserver, hub of all things, between 2012 and 2015. We, of course, set up contracts for the use of data accounts in servers. We ensure transactions are legal, safe, and secure for data flows to and from every data account. You think of it as an equivalent of a bank account management system. These contracts are between server owners, which are individuals or SMEs, and application owners. At the third level, we are a scheme operator in the sense that we enable legal transactability and stewardship of data to and from data accounts. So Dataswift can't see anything inside the data servers or any information inside these data accounts at all. We broker the third-party data source storage, first-party data access and storage, and second-party portability. More importantly, this is equivalent to a BACS or CHAPS for bank account, essentially enabling that any third-party data source that comes into a data account can actually be transactable out of the data account as second-party or zero-party data. So whether you take in your banking data or whether you take your health data from Cleveland, you can bring it over to Johns Hopkins, or you can bring from Singapore all the way to Malaysia, and it can be doing it completely outside of the scope of every data regulation in the world. So the freedom of which you can bring health records, financial records, any records from third or first party into any destination in the world across every single border in the world. We, of course, provide the architecture for the data passport system, which is equivalent to a debit card. And what we will enable is individuals to view their data passes that sits in the data passport. So your data pass can be, I'm above 21. It could be, I'm AB positive, AB plus is a blood group, or I'm pre-diabetic. And it can be without PII. So you can almost provide just the attribute without the actual identity. But you also can provide with identity, for example, to bring your own KYC and to be transacted with a merchant data terminal, much like you can today take payments with the debit card system and bring it to a merchant, a payment terminal anywhere in the world. We provide the data passport system to enable that to happen. And of course, we've enabled the discoverability of all who has what data with the data pass network to ensure that every parts of the data, whether you have a credit score in Vietnam, or whether you have some health data in Malaysia, that different merchants and different services in the world can provide services in for that data fully with the autonomy and the choice and freedom of individuals, and that sharing from all partners from within any application or website. So of course, it is always the individual or the SME that matches and fulfill that data requirements across border and across all apps and websites. Typically how it works is that there's a data passport like an e-wallet or an e-payment system that sits inside a consumer app that has a data passporting functionality that then have data passes. And based on the data passes, there are matched offers, whether or not if you're a car club owner, you're an AB positive, you're a kidney dialysis patient, you can be able to find services, support, care, or any other offers from a merchant network, from a double-sided network. That's typically, and we can do both offline, physical environment, as well as online. The merchant data terminal on the other side, which is the merchant that's offering services for the pieces of data that you hold, can provide complementary offers and end-to-end traffic report, as well as targeted audience with conversion to partners, bringing the data to partners because you wish to bring that data over to partners. So let me very quickly, this is some example. There's a huge health data passport campaign in Malaysia for losing 1 million kilogram, where you can bring your weight loss data or any kind of weight data over to wellness businesses, dietitians, and fitness group with data passes that will take you to any merchants in the wherever data passports are being accepted. And also in Brazil, you can get your credit score, income verification, or alternative risk score using Facebook data and banking data, and transact with insurance company and micro lenders. So the world that we wish to see is when individuals have their own data and be able to transact and share with merchants whenever they wish to, in a way that is safe and secure. And to come, of course, the history of our technology is that we come from now more than 33 million pounds worth of grants from academics across 10 countries and many universities. But to come up to talking about data trust, which is the topic of today, is to think about how do we think about bottom-up data trust, and how do we think of aggregating personal data and access contracts to create these data trusts. In our world, because data is fully portable, it is fully ownable, it has entitlement, and it has, and because it has entitlement, you have the freedom to transact. For a trust, therefore, to exist to us, that property, that it must be capable of being settled into a trust. And data, of course, with work from many different academics, some of them from Sylvie and from Neil, and many others have said that data really cannot be considered to be property. And the individuals are therefore unable to express rights over their data. In the Dataswift environment, for example, our personal data accounts and our personal data servers and that enable intellectual property rights over data. So the question, therefore, is how then do you think about trust? How do you think about how to reduce the information asymmetry, which is basically what I have, what you have, and how can we ensure that these credentials are grouped in such a way that everybody can benefit from it? Is the trust, say, of your Facebook data or your banking data to be from between the banks themselves, or is it with you? And this is really important for us, because I can offer my Facebook data just as much as Facebook can offer my Facebook data. So you have two sources of data here. Just as in Barclays Bank, you can offer Barclays data about me, or you can apply, be able to apply my data about Barclays data about me. So there are two sources of data. When we think about the problem of rights and think of problem of property, in the world of data trust, there is a choice with our infrastructure, which is the choice of source data or subject owners data. And that is something that we consider all the time. The legal basis, of course, is the basis for contracts. We've been looking at whether or not it meets the Wilberforce test for property right. Definable, identifiable. Why do we want to create the trust? What is the trust for? Who is settling into the trust? What are the contracts? Is it just for a data account within an individual server? Is it the whole server itself? How do we then think about these data trusts and the access to these data trusts? Would it take away agency from the individual, or whether or not are we willing to pass the agency on to a trustee? These are the things that Dataswift has been looking at. I'm actually in Singapore working with some of the academics in the law faculty in the National University of Singapore to really looking at how we can think about trust in the form of the data that is either distributed within the personal data accounts, and what the implications are in terms of the rights and the usability of the data. And also, do we actually settle the actual data, the IPR, the intellectual property of the data within the server itself, or do we settle the contracts that provide access to some of this data? So these are some of the things that we've been thinking about, and more importantly, also on the role in the market. We've been looking at various ways of aggregating different PDA owners, but we are also mindful of the fact that a decentralized world that we live in, the value of data comes from its mobility and transactability, whereas the value of centralized data comes from its aggregation and its insight. So these two sides, decentralized data has a different set of value, and or centralized have a different set of value. Are we not trying to mix up the value and thinking that we're trying to use mechanism in a centralized system for a decentralized system when the value system is actually quite different? And so we've been looking at how do we then think about how, what is it that the trust is supposed to do in the market? Does it create greater choice and freedom? Does it allow the markets? I'm sorry, I'm a market design economist. I design the markets and where the transactions are in terms of where the value can be best realized, and for the market to actually be able to achieve certain freedoms to play out, and more importantly, that this will benefit SMEs. We're not that we're trying to do something and then the beneficiary of this is going to be just another set of large organizations. That this should really open up the market for SMEs, for innovative services. And one of the things we look at is to look at the whose best interest is it? Not just data subjects who already have ownership, but also the services offered to data subjects from more SMEs than large organizations.
Irene, I feel it's time to wrap up.
Yeah, that's me. Well, I'm actually done.
Okay, great. Thank you, Irene. That was a very dense presentation. And my mind is still buzzing from it. Well, John, if you don't mind taking the floor now, it's your turn. We will take questions afterwards. So I suggest you each give your spiel, and then we'll take questions afterwards.
Thank you, Sylvie. I will just try and share my screen. There we go. So thank you for inviting me to speak today. So I was thinking about technology for data trusts and trying to pin down exactly what that means. And I think data trusts can exhibit a lot of variety, I think, in the way the structures and nature of the data they actually contain. And so I tried to abstract what I thought were the key features of the data trust. And I tried to come up with what I'm calling data trust life cycles. So how do you go about building a data trust, and how do you go about maintaining a data trust, and what does that mean in technology terms? And so the first step for me on this journey, I think, was thinking about where do you actually get the data from for a data trust. And I think this step is around recruiting and enrolling members. And in order to understand the technology needed to do this, I think you also have to ask some maybe more fundamental questions, such as why are people signing up? Why are organizations signing up to be part of this data trust? And if you take it a step further on that question as well, it's about returning value to the people who sign up into the data trust. So now value is a concept that will take many forms, and I'll loop back to that when I get to the end of the life cycle. But you need some kind of mechanism, which may be technical, may not be technical, for returning that value. I think also the data trust concept also plays heavily into the notion of a community of practice or a community of interest as well. And so technological solutions that underpin those communities, I think, are also extremely important. So just to tie this to something a bit more concrete in terms of technologies. So I've recently been involved in a project called Civic Data Identity Platform, which has been looking at these issues, but doing so in the context of blockchain. as an underlying technology that will enable you to deal with the process of signing up and recruiting, but also of returning value back to people. The second step in a data trust, in my view, or in the life cycle, is how you actually populate it with data. Where does the data actually come from? And how do you get it into the data trust? Now, I work in healthcare primarily, and a lot of the data we deal with, obviously, is personal data about people's healthcare. And actually, it's very difficult to move that kind of data around. Normally, it has to stay in place. And so this brings up the question as well about, well, what underlying technology are you employing for creating or populating the data in the data trust? Is it one giant big database if you've got data that's movable? Or do you have to look for different solutions such as federated data infrastructure, where the data remains under the control of the organization that's participating in the data trust? This also brings up some of the technical issues around data harmonization. So has everybody got the data in the same format, or is there work there to do to make sense of it? And I also think it brings up another question around the data trust itself is, are you involved in the business of managing data, or are you managing access to data? And I think we can make the distinction there. The third step in the life cycle is making data accessible. So this is one of the reasons for the data trust to exist. And in order to do this, I think we need to employ some technological capabilities. So for example, metadata description. So you need to describe what data the data trust has to make it useful to anyone who wants to consume that data. I think also there's another question here as well around, are you providing data to people, or are you providing access to data to people? And in the healthcare domain, a term you'll hear a lot at the moment, people often talk about trusted research environments or secure data analytics facilities, where actually people can come to the data and access it, rather than being giving extracts of data. And again, I think there's a question here around, well, have you managed to create that one big data base, or have you got a federated architecture of data, and do you need to do federated data analytics, which is, again, a very complex and emerging area of technology. My fourth step on the data trust lifecycle is maintaining trust. And by this, I mean keeping the contributors, so the data contributors, engaged with the trust, being able to prove that you actually do what you say you will do. I think in this area, there are technological solutions. So privacy preservation, particularly in the world of health data, is an extremely important issue, which enables you to comply with law and regulation. Audit trails, so being actually to be able to approve without a chance of it being mutable, that what happened is what you said happened. And of course, transparency, so being able to, again, demonstrate irrefutably that what you did was what you said you would do. And then my last step on the data trust life cycle is around sustainability. So it's all very well creating a data trust, but what is the model that will keep it sustained? So where is the revenue coming from to support what could be complex technical infrastructure, the associated people to maintain it and operate it. And of course, in some cases, depending on how you're structuring the data trust, returning the value back to the members or participants in the data trust. So on this last point, here's a model that we came up with during the Civic Data Identity Platform project that looks at potentially how three important concepts could flow through a particular model like this. And it's quite abstract. So we looked at the way that the data would flow, we looked at the way that the money could flow, and we looked at the way that services would be provided through this chain of value. I said I'd talk a little bit about what data subjects want from this. And there could be a variety of things between money, service, influence, tokens, particularly a blockchain sense, points, or nothing indeed if you have a very altruistic bent, or even just certainty on use. So actually being able to know that my data has been used in the way that I expect. And so that's where I'm actually going to stop. I could go into more details on the blockchain implementation and usage of the blockchain, but we can save that, I think, for questions. Thank you very much, Sylvie, and I will hand over.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I will pass the floor to David, but I'm going to already pin down the fact that John has used the word federated infrastructure, and I want to come back to that because I'm very keen to understand that better. So David, the floor is yours.
Merci. I shall, give me 2 seconds, I'll start the slideshow. And I need to share my screen. Okay. Let's share the right screen, I think. There we are. Can you all see that okay? Right. So obviously the brief was the technologies behind data trusts. So I've tried to deal specifically with that. I've got a very short piece at the end about some of the ways we're working with data trusts and the approach that we take, but I'm really going to try and just step through what we think are the key technologies, and it won't be any surprise to people to find out that much of this sort of thing is already being done. So there are some critical technologies. It's a very long list. I realize I may be introducing terms that need explaining, but I think they've already been mentioned. At the top of the list, if you want to think about technologies, they're technologies that underpin the confidence and trust in data trusts. So audit and surveillance, who's watching the watchers, how are things being processed, are people behaving correctly, are people's rights being protected, is the governance of a data trust acting with integrity? There's a real risk there that I'll come on to. And how transparent are the activities of a data trust in terms of its behaviors? So I think trust is the word that keeps being put about. How do we measure trust? You've then got, of course, rights management. And what I mean by that is, let us say that an individual or an organization provides data to a data trust. They will say that the rights I'm giving you to use it cover the following things. And therefore, it's inherent upon the data trust to make sure that the data is only used for the purposes to which an individual or an organization agreed. And there are many examples of where that has gone wrong, which I'm sure we could talk about. Tariff management is my term to describe what fees or access are provided on what basis. And there are things where people will be able to participate in a data trust and access it entirely free of charge because it delivers some form of social benefit or value exchange that's not measured in money. But there may also be different tariff models which could be based on the number of transactions, the type of data. I'm not going to go into it in great detail because the monetization side, I think Irene sort of went through in quite a lot of detail, but I would put a shout out for public benefit tariffs as well, which is where there's no money changing hands, but it's in the public good. And I think we're living through a pandemic, trying to cure cancer and all manner of other type of uses that might not involve charging for it. There is also, in a sense, reconciliation, because if a data trust is acting on behalf of individuals or other organizations, they have to have technology that allows them to reconcile any income or uses of data that have been made to communicate back to the donors of that data exactly what they've done with it. So I think reconciliation of transactions is important. And then, like any service, there's a catalog. What data does this data trust have? Why does it have it? What can it be used for? How can it be integrated? And I think of it as a catalog that anyone would look up and go, I'd quite like to be able to do that. The other area that we think is very emergent is what we call dynamic data sets. A lot of the historical big data analytics engines built data models, and then they try to make use of them. But what we're seeing increasingly is that as research is done, as business develops, as public services develop, there is a need for different types of data to be added to the existing data model. So we think the ability in technology terms to dynamically create new data sets off a whole diverse range of data sets is important. I'm now going to use the phrase API, application programmer interface. I have to explain this a lot, but it's the way two computers talk to each other without a human being involved. And you need to have these so that one organization that might be subscribing to the data trust can make requests of it and get information back safely and securely. And equally, on the flip side of that, organizations and individuals that might be delivering data to a data trust for use or making their data available for use need to have, as was just John said, metadata, a phrase called interoperability, that you can trust the data and understand the data between two different environments. We deal with variations in age, for example. One organization classifies age 18 to 25, somebody else classifies it 16 to 24. So, these are disconnects in data that are really complicated to resolve, or very simple if you design it correctly. And then there's the issue of scalability and resilience. If data trusts are to be something that can plug into everyday life to make life easier, to help make things happen, they have to be scalable and resilient. If they're only to be used for research, which isn't mission critical or time critical, then maybe it's a different thing. The world we live in, everything is mission critical. So we have to think about scalability and resilience, and that's making sure that if one system goes down, there's another system to keep it going so that you don't lose data or access to information. And there is often, and I think it's already been mentioned, the issue of right location for the data. And you may have regulatory rules about where certain data must reside. Some countries say personal data can't leave the country it's in. There may be rules about the type of processing that should or should not be done and where it could or could not be done. And then you've got what I would call processing services, things that a third party might do, or the data trust might do, or the provider of the data might do to make the data easier to use, or they might anonymize it. And what that means is you get the value of the data in terms of research and analysis, but you don't know who the data relates to, whether that's an individual or a organization, for example. And there's another phrase which is called pseudo-anonymization, which basically means that there is a mechanism to work out who the person was if it is needed to be, but it's a sort of nuanced point. And then the other bit of processing we're seeing more and more of is the idea that you don't want the data, but you want the answer to a question. And that is where you're performing question and answer processing on big volumes of data and answering specific questions or performing specific analysis and sending the data back to somebody. So it's cutting down the risk, the overhead, and improving the quality and consistency. So for us, those are the critical areas of technology that underpin data trusts. But I want to reassure everybody that's listening, this stuff's happening every day and has been happening for decades. Data trust is a new cool term that has come up to some extent. But if you look at credit reference agencies like Experian or LexisNexis or Equifax, their entire business model is about aggregating data, converting it into useful services that help particularly organizations, governments, etc., validate and check information about individuals and also undertake research. Amazon, eBay, Alibaba have ginormous data platforms which they use for their own purposes and their partners. Meta, formerly known as Facebook, with their Instagram and WhatsApp, if they are nothing if not a large volume data processor who can analyze and provide great insights. They do it for commercial reasons and gains. But TikTok, pharmaceutical companies, transport, travel, they're all doing this using this type of technology. So you have to ask yourself, what is the difference? And I think that comes down to the why of a data trust. Why does it exist? What are its missions and purposes? And what legal structure does it hold? And who is it trying to help ultimately at the end of the day? If it's an entirely commercial endeavor like Amazon or credit reference agencies or pharma, then you might look at it differently to a research organization that is trying to solve a complicated problem or understand things. And obviously, UK government, Research Data Scotland just been formed. That's going to be a data trust. They don't want to give away the data. They want to make it valuable and usable. And of course, our intelligence services are probably one of the largest processors of data, and it's a massive data trust, but nobody gets to use it apart from them. So I think please be reassured that this isn't the white heat of technology. When it comes to data trust, there are some really interesting research projects going on under the Horizon Europe funding cycle around multi-party computing and other bits of technology, but the core of data trust capability already exists today. Now, I do talk about this a fair bit. It may be blasphemy to some, but I think there are some risks in the current thinking around data trusts. There is an attitude that's creeping into some parties that talk about data trusts, about citizens and how they talk about them, which we find really problematic as a community interest company that serves citizens. There's a sort of element of paternalism in the language. The great and the good decide for us all. Quangos of elites would be a phrase I might use in some rooms. There is a sort of sense of condescension and dismissiveness about citizens' rights or the ability or their interest to understand what's going on. And at worst, you find arrogance where the organizations see the data as theirs by right, and they don't really want the scrutiny that data trusts could bring to them about how the data that they have or that they are using is being processed. And then the other area that I think the point just made about federated, which we'll come back to, is organization-centric thinking is the default thinking in the world today, both in terms of architecture and it. Sorry, that's my head of security's just barked. I'm going to let it out. Bad decision to put him in the room. And what we're seeing is the proliferation of more and more centralized databases with consequential security risk. And I think we need to start thinking about how we can create federated solutions to data trusts. There are business model issues about how do people cover their costs and retain the integrity of what they're doing if they genuinely are meant to be a trust. And then there are fundamentally governance issues. We've seen some terrible failures of governance on many systems where you thought the people appointed were supposed to be working on behalf of the individual or a mission, and it turned out that they had vested interests. We only need to talk about the pandemic to know about the VIP lane and various other things that went on. So I think the other risk is this lack of empowerment of citizens. I heard Irene's passionate talk about citizens having a means of participating in control. We completely believe in that, but I don't see the direction of travel in a lot of data trust initiatives talking about citizens actually being an active participant. And we think that's a massively missed opportunity. And I think that's where the federated approach can really, really make a difference. So I think what's missing at the moment from the debate is trust and confidence. How do you establish that? How do you ensure active participation? You don't need to be a data scientist to know that you quite like to cure cancer or help with Alzheimer's or stroke prevention or potentially improve the environment. I think people can understand and want to participate in those types of things. I think knowledge and awareness of the value of personal data, of data that can be combined and what good it can do, I think is an ongoing communications challenge. We need to separate in people's minds the difference between open data and personal data, because they are both very different things. And then it comes down to informed consent and transparency. And I think certification plays a big part in that. If you can independently be certified as a data trust, we have ISO 27001 and fair data. We would commend that to anybody. It's a really intensive process, but I think valuable and important. But all we do is we apply the same technology to plug those gaps that I've talked about. We're taking a different approach, enabling individuals to be active participants, and we equip citizens to be part of data trusts. And our personal data store sits there in the middle, pulling information from a human being's life and then making it available into data trusts so it can be combined with other sources of data that are either commercially available or open to allow multiple parties to make use of it. And we're doing that for real in Scotland, most of it, but we have other projects. But we have a platform we call Include, which is a living data trust where citizens are active participants. They provide information back for insight and analytics. Organizations can ask them for information. They can work entirely anonymously to be an active participant in those things. So that's our take on data trusts and the challenges, and that's me finished.
I want to mention here is the word federated has appeared a lot. And I have always been confused about this. So I'm going to give you my dummy understanding of what federated means, okay? And you're going to correct me, please. So what I understand is that let's take the decentralized scenario I was mentioning, okay? So let's imagine you have a data trust where members of this data trust have decided they don't want to pool all their data or as much as their data as possible in one central pot. They are happy for their data to remain on the servers of their bank, on the servers of Tesco, and on the servers of Amazon, say. But they want insight from their data in a way that's not possible for the moment. Now, as far as I understand, the idea between federated machine learning techniques is that you train an algorithm across several decentralized data sets. Okay, so it could be a data set that's based on servers of HSBC and a data set based on servers of Tesco, let's say. I don't know how it's done technically. I would love to understand that better because it seems to me significant. If you can do that, then it means that the concept of decentralized data trust has a lot more appeal because you could give insights to the members of that trust without necessarily pulling the data. I'm going to stop talking now. I felt I had to intervene to try and at least help iron out some misunderstandings. please, each of the panelists now, I would encourage you to ask a question of the other panelists, and then we'll open up in exactly 7 minutes to the rest of the audience. So you have 7 minutes to ask each other's questions.
Same question to both. Could you each give your definition of federated? Because I'm sure we're probably going to end up with 4 definitions.
I'm happy to go first. I think it's probably going to be, yes, at least 4. So for me, there are, as Sylvie mentioned, actually, you can either do a centralized model where you put everything into one database, or you can do what we term federated, where data sources are held on separate systems that have characteristics that disconnect them. So it could be separated across a computer network, separated by authentication and access mechanisms, and federation is the capability to try to treat these as if they were a single database in reality when they are not. And so federation masks the complexity to the end user of actually how that data is stored across multiple different systems. And this could apply to being able to just query those databases, or it could apply to running, as Sylvie suggested, complex machine learning algorithms over these databases. But the concept behind federation is to try to mask the complexity of the underlying data sources and where they may be held and what security permissions may apply to them, so that they do in fact look like one database.
Irene?
Right. So a concrete example for federated for me is what we're doing, for example, in Vietnam now, where a single source of data, for example, e-commerce for a sole trader, has all his transactions for all his shop. He's a sole trader, he has all his transactions. But at the same time, within the bank that he has banked with has also a set of transactions. So the bank is a source of set data. EPOS is a set of data. Both cannot give him a proper credit score for the life of whatever the data they have, because each has only a very narrow view of the individual sole trader. So they come together and give it back to the individual. And at the individual sole trader level, he has a personal data server, which is of course our technology. So my apologies for being skewed towards our architecture. It's a shameless plug. But the idea, for example, where there's any data store, is the idea that if you bring it all back into yours, you can either run an edge compute to create a better credit score, to give them better access to credit, or you can run a federated system where each will have some way of being able to share. And it, to me, is a question of control and autonomy. Now, in this case, which is a genuine case right now, we are actually doing, both sources of data are not able to collect enough to give a proper credit score. A federated system makes sense, where the control and power belong to the individual, in this case, the sole trader. But of course, it is of commercial benefit to both, because whatever that composite score that comes out of it for access to credit can then be shared with both, and therefore be able to immediately create better access to credit and access to new markets. So that's how we tend to look at federated data.
I recognize both. I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle. My view of federation is one of practicality. And the practicality comes from frequency of use of certain types of data, the different use cases for data that might prioritize synchronizing data from its data source into a more efficient processing environment, but the link between the source and the central processing environment is maintained, and it's something that's administered, but they belong to a federation or a trust framework where the rules of the road are understood about how data moves, how it's harmonized. But what you're not doing is you're not trying to solve every insight request at the get-go and building a giant data lock or a data lake. Locks are in Scotland, that's what they call them. And what can be in that federation can be individuals who have personal data stores hosted in the cloud that are updated automatically with a whole range of data from other sources, and they can give consent on a policy basis for it to be used. They don't have to be involved on a day-to-day basis. And equally, it can pull in data from open data services and other things to combine them together. So I think it's all about flexibility with security. So we always have the phrase safe, secure, and consensual. And at the heart of a federation is a set of rules of the road. And they're called trust frameworks at a sort of technical level, and people run schemes or operators. And I think data trusts are going to be running federated data trust schemes, which deal with the data sources and the integration of the data. So that's what we mean by federation. I think whether or not some bit of machine learning does something clever is irrelevant, frankly. The really important thing is that the data is available for whatever processing is needed, whether that's, as we're doing with Edinburgh at the moment, feeding into machine learning that can build algorithms that detect abnormal behavior in the home for people that are living on their own, or whether or not it's to help somebody get out of debt or help with their cancer treatment, which is the sorts of areas we work on.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm struggling, but I'm not going to say anymore. I'm going to let the audience come up with their questions. So there is a Q&A and there's the chat. At the moment, the Q&A is empty, but we do have lots of questions in the chat. So many that it's hard to know where to start. Okay, I would. Well, is there? I don't think I can let any member speak, right?
I think you can if you're in if you go to the attendees tab,
okay,
and hover over a person, you can click allow to talk.
Ah, interesting. Okay, never tried that before.
Neil Lawrence has got his hand up.
Oh, well, okay, I need to allow him to speak. This is going to be interesting. Allow to talk. There you are. Neil, the floor is yours.
Hey, Sylvie, great job, everyone. Really enjoyed everything we've been listening to. I just wanted to summarize for you a little bit what's going on in the chat. There's been quite a lot of questions about the extent to which, and I know you'll be able to give expert answers. I've been giving some clumsy answers, and Paul has shared some about work on this, how these aspects apply internationally. I think that there's some work to do to point out all the work that's been done in this space, including the recent GPI report and our working report, but you also have much more detailed knowledge of that. So a lot of the questions have been that. I don't know if you wanted to say something about that, or the group wants to say something about that.
Neil, you mean about data trust and their meaning internationally, or?
Yeah, or whether these ideas transfer out of common law and to what extent they transfer. Common
yeah,
law,
I mean, but you see, I'm hesitant to speak too much about that because it's interesting. This is intersection between really tech questions and legal questions. Okay, on the legal front, there's been for some time a debate about whether this idea of data trust can be exported to non-common law countries. Okay, and the argument is it can, and the key element here in this answer is to focus on the functional elements of the trust. Okay, and one of these key functional elements is the idea of fiduciary duty is vested in an intermediary layer. So fiduciary duties, again, is a term that is slippery. It's sometimes used to mean very little. In the UK, at least, it means a lot, and in many countries, it means a lot. But the exact meaning of fiduciary duties is determined by the court. So there will be a local variation across countries. What I want to say, though, and what's important, is that at the end of the day, a fiduciary duty implies an absence or undivided loyalty, effectively. So you can't have a fiduciary duty and be loyal to the people in the data trust while at the same time, say, answering to your shareholders. Yeah, and that's why you can't impose a fiduciary duty on the platform, whether it's Facebook or something else. It doesn't make sense because you can't be absolutely loyal to the data subjects whose rights you are trying to exercise, let's say, or implement, and at the same time be loyal to your obligations to your shareholders. So that's just one point that I should emphasize. So you can replicate the functions of trust outside the common law, yes. And one of the things, though, that is an obstacle is in many countries at the moment, there are no positive rights when it comes to personal data, right? So what can you do in that case? Can you create bottom-up empowerment tools? I say yes, but it's true that in that case, Irene, I see you have your hand raised, so I will let you take the floor. But I should just say that when there are no positive rights granted by a country, let's say Bangladesh is the country that comes to my mind, then you're gonna have to focus on basically collective action mechanism that leverage often the data itself rather than the rights over the data. But we can come back to that if need be. Irene, you had a question.
Yeah, I think I have a comment more than a question.
Okay.
First, on the question about portability in the law, I think for us anyway, on our architecture, which is global and cross-border is a very, very big part of what we do, particularly around trade finance and portability of data. Now, we are pretty much our architect. The reason why we have such a strong governance and policy layer is because we are out of scope of every single data regulation in the world. Today, you can take the Singapore medical records in Singapore and bring it over to Johns Hopkins Hospital without any interference from any global data regulation. And if you wish to regulate a personal data server platform where individuals are personal data processor and controller, you're literally regulating every single person entering your country with a laptop, and you don't want to do that. So from our perspective, data is fully portable. Now, that's the reason why our governance are so draconian, because there is therefore another layer that we have to introduce to ensure that transactions are safe, smooth, and secure. But coming back to law, yes, there are countries that will, if you need to, then have some kind of personal data rights. But for us, our rights are contract. To us, it's all about the right to contract. And if you have the right to contract for your individual to check into a hotel from Chicago to Singapore, then you have the right to contract for the data that belongs to you in your own personal data server. So on that basis, therefore, we believe very much in the markets and what the markets can do. Insofar as trust is concerned, it therefore acts very much like property. Now, there are some nuances because, as you know, property data is not ownable in a typical way as property rights. However, the way personal data servers are constructed in our architecture, they are, in a sense, intellectual property rights of a person. And therefore, any data that's actually being transferred across border is actually a licensing contract and not actually consent in our architecture. Given that to be the case, the settlor of a trust can therefore be treated as a settlor of any particular contract or an intellectual property right. So you can therefore settle it in different ways. Now, there are many, even though that you can settle IPR and you can settle different other kinds of contracts, that doesn't diminish the fact that it is still a hard thing to do to create any trust based on any kind of property rights, whether it's property or IPR or patent, or in this case, your own personal data server. It is still a hard thing to do, and therefore we always ask the question, why are you doing it for? What are you doing it for? And how are you doing it? And why would you want to do it? So that's just a few points of law that might be useful for some of the audience.
Two hands. I think Neil was first and then David. So Neil, you have the floor first.
Yeah, I was just really curious. We were getting into the legal niceties as well, which is great, super interesting. But I really liked John's sort of very pragmatic presentation as someone who's trying to use these technologies as a means to an end. And I wondered, from his perspective, which I see as a sort of like an objective perspective, John, what are your thoughts on these issues, and to what extent are they coming up in your efforts to deploy this work as a means to an end, was my question.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I mean, I think, as you said, I tried to take a very pragmatic view of this, and I think where we started and where we've done a lot of research is around what do people really want from this, especially in the context of sharing their own health data, and empowerment keeps coming up, and the empowerment that they really talk about is, well, I'll give you a very concrete example. So in health data, there have been several national initiatives to create a big database of everybody's data. And the most recent example of this is the general practice data research database. And the government has given people an opt-out from this database. And currently about 6% of the English population do that. And when you study these people and you ask why they opt out, they do so because they are uncertain about how their data will be used, and concerns around data being sold when they don't actually want that. But what they don't mind is the data being used, for example, to improve the services of the NHS or to further academic research. And so it's actually finding the mechanism that enables them to have their say, which is really all they want to do is to have their say at the start and say, I just want to make sure my data isn't used for or sold to medical insurance companies, for example. I just want it to be used for the purposes that I want. And starting from that foundation, finding a legal mechanism, and data trust is a really good one, is a very practical and good way of doing this, because actually as well, empowerment doesn't necessarily mean I want to make every decision for myself. I want to be involved on a daily basis in making decisions about how my data is used. I want to do this once and then have certainty about how it's used in the future. And that's what we see, Neil, from a very pragmatic, trying to actually just move away and do things that have real world benefits.
I would completely echo John, and our entire emphasis is around allowing people to express their wishes and their policy and have it enacted. We're not in the monetization space around data. We're in the enablement of citizens, removing friction, effort, risk, and cost. I suppose the question I wanted to ask Sylvie is, the session was billed as technology for data trusts, and I feel as though it's a different title that you might have been better here, because I think you're really talking philosophically about how agreements get made. And I would say, okay, given one of the opening points I made was about how do you trust, how do you have confidence? The technology that gives people confidence, I think, is emerging as opposed to mature at this point in time. So, you know, we've had rights for a long while under the UN Declaration of Human Rights and GDPR that says we can have transparency, but how do you respond to knowing what's going on, and how do you express wishes? So I'm just a bit concerned that have we missed the agenda, because the title might have taken us down a certain route, but actually I think what you're really interested in, and I loved your phrase bottom-up data trust, because I do think this idea of collective action by individuals to want to achieve something, just as John's talked about, that they're happy for their data to be used in a given set of ways, is exactly the area that we tend to work on. You know, somebody's going through a cancer journey or trying to get out of debt or access public services or improve their community. And they're happy for their data to be used for things like that. They don't have to be bothered and spammed 50 times a day saying, will you share your name and address? It's actually more about joining schemes and trusts. So I just suppose from my perspective, I always like to hit the target, and I'm worried that we've misunderstood the target based on the title and the brief. But what technology do you feel is needed to address the point you're focusing on?
Well, that's the whole point of this discussion, is that there is no settled answer to that, right? As you say, the technologies are far from mature. And today it's really a pragmatic focus. I mean, we're about to launch these pilot data trust. We don't have the answers to all the questions, including what technologies should be used, in what circumstances, in exactly what form. And if we've ended up intersecting between technological questions and legal questions, actually, I find that you may find that distracting, but I think it's a sign.
No, I think it's spot on. I tried to allude to it in my slides, but I could have had a whole section on the legal element of this, but I tried to keep on what I'd understood was the agenda. But I think
it is the agenda.
Right.
The fact is, we just don't have the answers. There are still many questions on the legal front. There are also many questions on the technological front, and I find it fascinating that at the moment in this discussion, the questions are like intersecting. It's probably the best way of putting it. And I think there's never more fascinating discussion than when they intersect. But it's hard, right? Because we have to make sure we make sense to each other. And I think being invested in, when you develop platforms like you have, David, necessarily you get invested in a certain way of seeing things, which we have to understand. And there's an effort on everybody's part. And I know that I'm also sometimes speaking legalese and guilty of that. So I think actually we're very much on target, but please correct me if we're wrong. And to me, the conclusion, because it's actually, we have 3 minutes until wrap up, and John has a hands up. So John, I will let you have one more remark. David, do you have a pressing point or is it a historical?
I think that's an in-error hand. I don't think that's a problem. Let me take my hand down.
John, I'll give you a last word if you want, and then I will wrap up with a few key announcements before we close.
So I alluded to this in my talk around the project of the Civic Data Identity Platform. And what we've done there is we've experimented with blockchain technologies, and the principal reason behind that is to build on what David was saying. It's about trust and it's about transparency and building confidence. And sometimes a very good description of a blockchain is a confidence machine, because actually it enables you to implement smart contracts which are immutable, cannot be changed, and you have full transparency of the transactions and a immutable transaction log, which is a mechanism for building transparency and building trust. And that's all I wanted to say, but that's an example of harnessing a technology to solve some of these particular problems, although blockchain technologies themselves also bring a whole host of other problems as well, as we've discovered in the project. But for those particular things, they work extremely well.
Thank you, John. And actually on blockchain, I feel like almost we need another session, because I'm completely lost when it comes to blockchain technologies. But we are not going to open that kind of worms. I think now is the time to wrap up. One thing I need to say, first I need to thank you all for your contributions. I'm really grateful. And I hope we can keep engaging, because we will need more of your contributions as we seek to deploy real life data trust. So thank you. I want to highlight first our next seminar. In fact, there have been several interventions talking about the interest about bottom-up. What does bottom-up empowerment mean? Well, lo and behold, we do have a seminar coming up on exactly that, bottom-up empowerment, and what it means. Paula is going to copy the link to that seminar in the chat. So please follow the link to register to that next seminar. I encourage you all to attend. I think it's relevant whether you tech or not tech, legal or not legal, etc. We have additional seminars later this year. You can find out on the datatrust.uk website. There's also a lot of useful blogs that you may find interesting. I think that's it for me. Thank you all for attending, and see you next time.
Thank you. Been great.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
I see